Unable to trace its proper parentage, I have designated this as the Christmas story of the man and the birds. You know, the Christmas story, the God born a man in a manger, escapes some moderns. Mostly, I think, because they seek complex answers to their questions, and this one is so utterly simple. So for the cynics and the skeptics and the unconvinced, I submit a modern parable. Now, the man to whom I'm going to introduce you was not a Scrooge. He was a kind, decent, mostly good man, generous to his family and upright in his dealings with other men. But he just didn't believe all that incarnation stuff which the churches proclaim at Christmas. He couldn't swallow the Jesus story about God being born as a man. It didn't make sense, and he was too honest to pretend otherwise. "I'm truly sorry to distress you," he told his wife, "but I'm not going with you to church this Christmas Eve." He said he'd feel like a hypocrite, that he'd much rather stay home, but that they could go and he would wait up for them. So he stayed, and they went to the Christmas Eve service. Shortly after the family drove away, snow began to fall. He went to the door and watched as the flakes got heavier and heavier, then returned to his fireside chair to read his newspaper. Minutes later, he was startled by a thudding sound, then another, and another. He thought at first that someone must be throwing snowballs at his living room window, but when he went to investigate, he found a flock of birds huddled miserably in the snow. They'd been caught in the storm and, in a desperate attempt to find shelter, had tried to fly through his large landscape window. Well, he couldn't let the poor creatures lie there and freeze. He remembered the barn where his children stabled their pony. That would provide a good shelter if he could direct the birds to it. He put on his coat and boots and tramped through the deepening snow to the barn. He opened the door wide and turned on the light. But the birds did not go in. He figured food would entice them. So he hurried back to the house, fetched breadcrumbs, and sprinkled them on the snow, making a trail to the yellow-lighted, wide-open door of the stable. But to his dismay, the birds ignored the breadcrumbs and continued to flop around helplessly in the snow. He tried catching them. He tried shooing them by walking around them, waving his arms. Instead, they scattered in every direction except into the safe, warm barn. And then he realized that they were afraid of him. To them, he reasoned, I am a strange and terrifying creature. If only he could think of some way to help them understand that they could trust him, that he wasn't trying to hurt them, but help them. But how? Because every move he made tended to frighten them, confuse them. If only I could be a bird, he thought, and mingle with them and speak their language. Then I could tell them not to be afraid. Then I could show them the way to the safe, warm barn. But I would have to be one of them so that they could see and hear and understand. At that moment, the church bells began to ring, and the sound reached his ears above the sound of the wind, and he stood there listening to the bells. Adeste Fidelis, listening to the bells, pealing the glad tidings of Christmas, and he sank to his knees in the snow.